the organizing efforts were able to put momentum to other, to kind of further organizing efforts. So not just defending people, arrestees, but to build solidarity with other movements. If we remember, at this time was the Israeli state's latest incursion into occupied territory. So this was happening at the exact same moment that thousands of Palestinians were being killed by the Israeli Defense Force. People were able to draw those connections, organize the connections between police violence in Oakland and military violence in Gaza. People were able to mobilize and organize against a youth curfew that the city of Oakland tried to roll out a month after this, and were effective in stopping this criminalization of youth. People were able to reinvigorate cop watching strategies. So, and one of the lasting legacies of this is now it's become a common practice for not even when there's police violence, but just when there's police, for especially young people, to hold up their phone and record the police wherever they're going, which is a tribute to the memory of Oscar Grant. It's done in remembrance of Oscar Grant, but also a very effective strategy to kind of stem that violence. Over? Okay. I'm going to stop.
So in terms of using this specific incident, obviously it's just one instance, it's just one place, and as Isaac said, it is exceptional really for us only in that it was so well documented and the response was so quick and so substantial. But for us, in terms of critical resistance and the work that we do, policing has always been a real centerpiece. As I said, we are a prison industrial complex abolitionist organization. And sometimes it's controversial to say abolition period, but I find often when I am in the company of lovely abolitionists, it's also controversial to say I am not a prison abolitionist. I'm a prison industrial complex abolitionist. And for me, it's actually not sufficient to not pay attention to policing and surveillance and courts, right? Very, very intentionally. So not as they are attendant parts of how people end up in cages, but how they actually drive populations, how they profile people, etc. And so for our analysis, to be holistic and to be comprehensive and to be consistent, both in terms of how we think but also how we make moves in the world, we really are trying to grapple with some of the difficulties that arise in thinking about the abolition of policing. In this case in particular, we found that one of the things that we're up against, let's see if I can find this, is, kind of working with our own base, right? So immediately calls went out, jail racist killer cops, right? So if we're prison industrial complex abolitionists, it stands to reason that it is not sufficient to use the court system, right, against the cop. And this raises, I think, really, really important issues for us, because if, we have an analysis around state violence and how the state enacts kind of consistent, persistent violence against communities of color in particular in the United States. And our analysis is like from slave catching to the war on drugs to homeland security and kind of everything in between, and looking at law enforcement really as a tool of the state to keep, enforcing capitalist ideals, to really suppress and repress people, right? And if we understand, our analysis says that the system is not broken. That's actually our position. We actually think the prison industrial complex works precisely as it should. It contains, controls, kills precisely who it is meant to contain, control, and kill, right? Policing does the same thing. This is why it's important for us to talk about this not being exceptional, not being a bad apple, not being, I picked up my gun instead of my taser, which is what this specific cop said, right? But to say this is what policing is. This is the act of policing, right? So we need to figure out ways to erode the power that policing has over us and to make cops and policing superfluous to how we make moves. That being said, we are in, a base of people who are really frustrated, who are really angry, who have been living under this kind of state repression for so long that they want justice, right? And so I really actually appreciated this kind of problematizing what justice looks like too, because that's been a big deal for us. Does putting a single cop in a cage change, right? We're talking about dismantle, change, build, right? Change the conditions in which we're living. And we would say no, no. I guess I think the only other thing that I kind of want to say about that, and then we want to get into some organizing examples to talk about some of the ways that we do what we do, is that we don't think this can be reformed, right? The idea really is we have to figure out how to be able to live without policing, right? And that creating an abolitionist framework, we need to be careful that we're not kind of tinkering, doing that reform game, right? Of tinkering with, okay, if we get an accountability process that's set up by the state, right, to mind itself, even though we might get a seat at the table, is that actually going to bring true accountability? Is that going to bring true change? So talk a little bit about the organizing examples as well, yeah?
Sure. Really quickly, when we think about the ways that we organize as an organization, it's very important for us to ground ourselves historically. So when we think about doing our work, where we do it and how we do it, we draw on our histories of resistance, these traditions, movements that have sought to dismantle systems of oppression, to change social relationships, economic relationships, relationships to land, etc., and to build a new and better world. So when we think of historical movements that we draw on, we obviously think of slave insurrection and the abolitionist movement around chattel slavery. We think about indigenous struggles. We think about third world liberation and anti-colonial struggles. The example of the Black Panther Party is very salient for us in Oakland, California, obviously where we are here as well. Practices of community self-determination, civil rights struggle, labor struggle, arts and cultural movements, so on and so on and so on. Just the last thing, when we think about, we don't just draw on these histories, we recognize how these histories are embodied in the people who make up and lead our actual movement. So this is not just to try to read history books and draw those lessons, but to understand that people engaged in this struggle are often from these movements, and that there's a continuity to these different histories. Rachel's going to talk a little bit about some specific work that's happening right now.